change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Matthew. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
And Jesus, he lived his whole life in the public eye. And so it was difficult for the Sanhedrin to find even false testimony against him. And so it had to be fabricated. So they had to find some wicked men who would sympathize with them and to actually change the words of Jesus to make him sound like he was a terrorist, that he wanted to blow up the temple when he was only talking about his own body being destroyed. And they knew it all, or else they would have arrested Jesus at the time when he said it. But nobody touched him then. And through all this, Jesus, he just remained silent. And he said nothing. And then the high priest questions him and he says, "Do you say nothing?" And Jesus still said nothing until the high priest put Jesus under an oath and commanded him to speak and said, "I put you under an oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." And that was the only question that the high priest had. He didn't ask him about the temples being destroyed. He didn't ask him about Jesus's allegiance to the laws of Moses or to Rome. Caiaphas's only question was, "Are you the Christ?" And Jesus's answer was short. "It is as you said." And then Jesus, he added something else. He added what it's going to look like the next time Caiaphas would see him. And he said that hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven. And if you notice in your Bibles, that word, the power is capitalized because what Jesus is referring to there, he's referring to God. Because this was just a respectful way to say God, because the Jews didn't use the name of God carelessly. And so now Caiaphas, he can't stand this anymore. And so he tears his clothes, and then he has Jesus beaten, mocked, and abused. Now Peter, he shouldn't have been following Jesus at all, because Jesus had already warned Peter that he would deny him, and he's already secured his release. And now in John's gospel, it was a little bit more clear. Jesus had told his disciples not to follow him because he told the Romans, he said, "Let these go their way." And right here, Peter, he's not being bold and he's not being brave. He's playing secret agent disciple. And there's absolutely nothing that Peter will be able to do for Jesus. And so after John secures Peter's entrance, Peter doesn't stand with Jesus. And we're told in John that he just stands with the enemy and he keeps himself warm by the fire. And Peter here, he wasn't confronted by the soldiers and he wasn't confronted by the temple guard. And Peter, he wasn't tortured and he wasn't persecuted, but he fell under the pressure of the questions of two little slave girls. And Peter, he should have left at this point, because by this time, the rooster probably had at least crowed once, because in Mark's gospel, we're told that the rooster would crow twice. So the rooster was going to crow 2 times. And then this third person who comes and confronts Peter, well, he was probably a slave also, because he was the cousin of the high priest's slave whose ear Peter had cut off. And when he confronted Peter in John's gospel, he said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" And he was talking about seeing Peter with Jesus, which literally means, "Did I not see you with my own eyes?" And then Peter denied this, and he started cursing and swearing. And this doesn't mean he was using swear words or he was using bad language. This means he was calling out curses on himself, and he was putting himself under an oath. He was saying something like, "If I'm not telling the truth, let me be damned. And then the second rooster crows. And we know from Luke's gospel account, at this very moment, Jesus turned around and he looked at Peter. I don't think Jesus looked at Peter the way that I would have looked at Peter. I would have looked at Peter and I'd have been shaking my head and I'd be thinking, see, I told you, Peter. But I think Jesus looked at him in love, and he looked at him to strengthen Peter, because he doesn't want Peter to become too despondent. He doesn't want him to think that he betrayed him the same way that Judas did. So even here, in the midst, literally, of Jesus' own trials, he's taking care of Peter. And Jesus is putting himself aside, and he's putting Peter first. And it was that look of love that broke Peter. And it sent this big fisherman running out into the night, crying bitterly. And that's a much different reaction than what Judas had. And all of this happened before probably about 3 a.m. because the Romans called this watch of the night from 12 a.m. to 3 a.m. the cock crow, because that's the time that roosters normally would crow in Israel. Okay, so now the morning comes, and now the Sanhedrin, they meet officially, and it doesn't take them very long because they already have their verdict. But now it's official, and they bring Jesus bound to Pontius Pilate, the governor. And we know that at first, Pilate, he tried to pawn this trial off on Herod because Jesus is from Galilee, and Herod, that's Herod's jurisdiction. But all Herod did is he just sent him back to Pilate for Pilate to deal with it. And then we see that there was another disciple of Jesus watching all these trials, and that was Judas. And Judas, he wasn't very happy about the outcome. And you kind of wonder, well, what was he expecting? What was he expecting to come out of that? And now it says that he's remorseful. And in the King James translation, it says that Judas repented himself. But Judas is not repenting here. It's a different word being used. He's just remorseful. He's just feeling guilty. Because things, they don't quite feel the way that he thought they would feel. And this illusion that he had of how things would turn out in his mind with all the grandeur and with all those lies and promises that Satan had made to him, well, they're all gone now. So now all he feels is dirty and empty, and he feels condemned over his betrayal, because Judas knows he was loved, and he knows that he betrayed that love. Now, this is what happens to all of us when we get caught up and we allow temptation to overtake us, where we may find ourselves betraying someone we love or betraying someone who loved us. And we do it for nothing, for just 30 pieces of silver, which is just a little more than a half a roll of quarters. And you can defend yourself, and you can say, I've never betrayed anyone like that. Well, I can't say that. And I think that I can say that. We've all betrayed Jesus at times. And I can honestly say that there's not a week gone by where I haven't betrayed Jesus in some way. And there's this thing that happens when you've been used by the devil and where you've been deceived, and that after your sin has been committed and all the pleasures that you thought you would have had, and all the things that you're going to get, that you were going to receive from the sin you committed, and you find that they're all gone. And now you're just sitting there and you're in your right mind, and all you feel is condemned and grossly empty. And you can't even stand yourself anymore. And you can't believe what you've done. How you could have been so carried away in your thoughts. But now all those thoughts are gone. And now that the deed's done, you can't undo it. Can't be undone. It was the devil that led you, and you were led. And you wouldn't have done those things if you were in your right mind. But now the devil's left you. And that one who incited you to sin has now become your chief accuser. And now he's condemning you, and he's condemning you mercilessly. Well, that's where Judas is here. That's where he is now. and he no longer wants his reward. That very thing that he coveted so badly, the thing he lusted for, the money, so he tries to return it. And they want no part of it. Those chief priests, they were so happy to receive him before, just like those people that were so happy to receive you before, who now wash their hands of you, and now they act like they don't know you. And now they let you know very clearly that you're never really one of us. You're never one of us. And they're disgusted with you too at what you did, even though they were the ones who enticed you to commit the act. And I'm afraid I understand this all too well, and I have been in this place more than I'd ever want to admit. And you're probably all wondering, well, why are we going to church here? And your wife's probably nudging you and saying, we need to find a new church. But the truth is, you have all probably been down this road before too, because we have all sinned, and we have all been led into sin, and we have all betrayed Jesus by our sin. And those who won't admit it, they're more like the chief priests and these other self-righteous religious leaders here in our story. And they won't admit any sin, but they're the ones who are actually currently sending Jesus to his death. And by Judas throwing those coins into the temple, into the inner sanctuary, which is called the Naos, and it's a place that only the priests could actually go. And so Judas is telling them, you're guilty of this too. And because these priests, and they find this money to be unclean, even though they were the ones who made it unclean, they knew they couldn't bring it into the temple. And all they could do with it is to buy something unclean with it. And so they bought the potter's field for a cemetery for strangers to have a proper burial. And with Judas here, and with him never committing his life to Jesus, he doesn't know what to do with all this guilt and condemnation. And he went to the wrong place to seek forgiveness. He went to the priests. But the only place that forgiveness could be found was in Jesus himself. But Judas never went to Jesus. And you really can't think that Jesus would have rejected Judas, because if you look at it, Jesus had never rejected Judas. Jesus loves Judas just like he loves the other 11. But the reason that Judas didn't seek forgiveness from Jesus, it was all out of his own pride, because he wouldn't bend the knee. And so it's not that Jesus rejected Judas, but it's that Judas rejected Jesus. So Judas didn't seek his forgiveness. So instead of that, what Judas did is he committed suicide and he hung himself. So I believe this is a totally different kind of story than the story we have here with Peter. Because Peter, he had truly committed his life to Jesus. Peter did bow the knee to him. Peter didn't go to the priest to seek forgiveness. He didn't go to the temple. He sought it from Jesus himself. Here with Peter's betrayal, because of his denial, Jesus, he doesn't want to lose Peter the same way that he lost Judas. He doesn't want Peter to go through that same type of self-condemnation that Judas went through. And that's why Jesus strengthened Peter when he looked at Peter after Peter's denial. Because I think it was a reminder to Peter of all that Jesus had told him, not only that he had denied him, but also that he was going to meet him in Galilee when this is all over. So I believe that Jesus gave Peter hope, and he gave him hope in that what he did was forgivable. And we can read about Peter's restoration in the Gospel of John. And then we end with this prophecy about these 30 pieces of silver used to buy the potter's field. And it's said here to have been given by Jeremiah. But if you read your Bible and you do a little research, you'll find that that prophecy was actually written in the book of Zechariah in chapter 11. And there's a couple possibilities of why it's attributed to Jeremiah. One is that it was a transcriptional error. It's just due to some scribe making a mistake. But another possibility is that Jeremiah actually spoke these words as a prophecy, and that Zechariah is the one who wrote them down. And the third is that the book of Zechariah, it is contained in the scroll called Jeremiah. And that Matthew is not referring to actual Jeremiah being the prophet, but he's referring to the scroll called Jeremiah. But the amazing part of all of this is that it all came true, and it came true exactly the way it said it was. It was the exact amount of money. It was the exact same field. And so next week, we're going to see the trial of Jesus before the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, and the crucifixion of Jesus. The story doesn't get any more exciting than this. This is getting to the very climax of this whole story. So maybe God has been talking to you, and maybe he's trying to warn you about something. Maybe there's something in your life, or maybe you've betrayed somebody, or maybe there's sin in your life where you feel like you're betraying Jesus, because we all have at sometimes betrayed Jesus, and we've all sinned. If you want to get right, you don't get right by just coming to the church. Judas didn't get right by just coming to the temple, just talking to the priest. If you need to get right, you need to talk to Jesus himself. And if you need to, because you don't need to go around condemning yourself about anything in your past or in your life. And you can get this right now, and you can get it right today. All right, so this is very early on Friday morning, and Jesus, he's been up all night, and he's exhausted, and he's already been beaten twice. The first was when he was struck before Annas, the former high priest, and then he was beaten under the instruction of Caiaphas, the current high priest. And now Jesus, he's being sent to Pontius Pilate, condemned to death by the Sanhedrin, which is the religious Jewish council. So they take Jesus to the Praetorium, which is the official residence of the military governor, Pontius Pilate. And both of these places, the Praetorium and Caiaphas's house, they're both known today. They've been excavated, and you can visit them. And they're both on the Via della Rosa, which is known as the painful path or the road of suffering. And you can see that dungeon where Jesus was most likely beaten underneath Caiaphas's house. And you can also see where the Roman soldiers, where they had beaten and mocked Jesus, which is beneath the Antonia fortress. And you can still see the board games that are etched into the pavement stones where the guards would play games. Now, Pilate, he wasn't regularly at the Praetorium. He was only there because of the Passover, because it was the custom of the governor to be in Jerusalem during the Passover. But Pilate's regular residence was at Caesarea Maritima, which was on the Mediterranean coast. And it's just like Herod, because Herod wasn't regularly in Jerusalem, but he just happened to be there also for the Passover. Now, when the Sanhedrin, they brought Jesus to Pilate, they couldn't bring the charge of blasphemy because Jesus calling himself the Son of God, it wasn't a crime in Rome. So the Sanhedrin, they brought 3 other charges to Pilate against Jesus. 1, that he's a revolutionary and he's misleading the nation. And then 2, he's inciting the people not to pay taxes. And then 3, claiming to be a king in opposition to Caesar. Now, in Matthew's gospel here, it only tells us about the second appearance of Jesus before Pilate. In Luke 23, that tells us of Jesus' first appearance, where Pilate, he tries to avoid making any judgment against Jesus by sending Jesus away to Herod, because Jesus belonged to Herod's jurisdiction. But Jesus, he wouldn't say a word in front of Herod. So Herod, he just sends Jesus back to Pilate because Herod, he's not interested. It's not his problem. And to Pilate, Jesus didn't look anything like a king. He's all dirty, he's bloodied, he's just wearing simple, plain clothing. He just looks like an average man. And here in Matthew, Pilate, he only asked Jesus one question, and that's, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And it's just like the night before, where the high priest Caiaphas asked Jesus just one question. And his question was, "Tell us, are you the Christ, the Son of the living God?" And Jesus gives Pilate the same exact answer that he gave to Caiaphas. "It is as you say." And so Jesus here, he confesses to being the King of the Jews. And that's the charge that Jesus will die for. He will die for being the King of the Jews. But in John's gospel, there's a longer conversation between Jesus and Pilate, where Jesus asks Pilate, and he says, "Are you asking this question for yourself? Or did someone tell you about me being a king?" And then Pilate, he made it quite clear to Jesus that he didn't care about Jewish things. He didn't care about Jewish messiahs. And we know this is true by Pilate's answer. And he said, "Am I a Jew?" And so Jesus explained to Pilate, he says, that he had no army and that his followers did not fight and that his kingdom is a different kind of kingdom. It's a kingdom of truth. His kingdom is a spiritual kingdom. And Pilate, through this conversation, Pilate concluded that Jesus was not a threat to Rome and that Jesus, he wasn't a dangerous revolutionary, where Pilate himself said, "I find no fault in him. He's innocent." And at this point, it should have been all over because Pilate, he had the authority to release Jesus, but he doesn't release Jesus. And that's because this is all political. This was all about how Pilate, who hated the Jews, had to appease the Jews because Pilate was on a short leash with Rome. And he was on his very last straw with Caesar Tiberius. Because you have to realize the only reason that Pontius Pilate was the governor of Judea was because he had married Caesar Augustus's granddaughter. And he had been appointed to that position of governor by Caesar Augustus's son, Caesar Tiberius. And just as much as Pilate hated the Jews hated Pilate. And that's because Pilate was a cruel and cowardly man, and he covered up his cowardice by his acts of violence. Where Pilate at one time, he had brought these pagan images into Jerusalem to be worshiped. And this got him into a lot of trouble with not only the Jews, but it also got him in trouble with Caesar Tiberius. And so Pilate, he couldn't afford any more trouble. And so this judgment of Jesus, it had to be handled not fairly, but diplomatically. So Pilate, he's trying really hard to come up with some kind of compromise. So not to upset the Jews, but also not to condemn Jesus. Because Pilate knew that Jesus was not guilty of anything, but that the Jews had only delivered him up because of envy. And so just within these few hours, because this is Friday morning, and all of this is happening before 9:00 a.m. But Pilate, in that time, he tries to release Jesus 5 times. But the Jews, they would have none of that. And Pilate, he's a very shrewd man, and he thinks he finds a solution. He finds a solution to his problem because there is a loophole where Pilate can use this custom of the Jews of releasing one prisoner at the Passover. And so Pilate, he picks the most vile criminal he has in custody. This man is an insurrectionist, which means he was a robber, and he was also a murderer. And so Pilate, he picks Barabbas. And the name Barabbas, it means the son of the Father. And if you look at the early manuscripts of Matthew, it includes Barabbas's full name, where his actual full name was Jesus Barabbas.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh, oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,